Good evening, everyone. I wanted to share some thoughts I was having about, these conversations that need to happen in our churches and in our communities and amongst our uh, white coworkers and friends and whatnot about racism. And part of what I find challenging is that people like to talk about race without context. And if you don't have the right context uh, when you're talking about race, you can misconstrue certain things. So I thought it was important to bring the right context to the conversation about race. Um, I hear statements like, we're all one race, the human race. Well, that's true. I agree with that. Acts 17, you can quote it, all you want. I agree. That is true, but you have to bring the right context, right? Because the context, nobody's debating whether we're all one race. Um, Another conversation that I've heard is I've seen where white people will take a black person who disagrees with like 90%, like this Candace Owens videos and stuff like that. They'll take a black person and pit it against another black opinion, um, rather than listening, right? Because their mind is kind of already made up on what they wanna believe, the kind of conversation they want to have. So they're like, "Hey, look, there's this black person, and what they're saying is what I believe," as if to ignore. Like I said, a lot of times the problem is the devil's in the details, and so what you find is that there is this resistance, and they leave out the context. Um, Another thing that I've heard, and I'll try to unpack this. Like, I heard of a pastor saying, race is the whole concept of race is not real. We're one race. The whole concept of race, and I'm saying, okay, well, the concept of a dollar bill is not real either. Dollar bill is just something that they printed a dead man's face on, and it has no value. And yet you got them in your pocket. You use them to go to the store. You use it to, so the issue is, sure, that's fine, but that's not the context that we live in, right? And so if we live in a context, in a racialized context in America, and frankly, the whole world does. I love, so I just think that's interesting when you're having these conversations. People say, "Oh, well, race is a social construct." I'm saying, okay, that's an arbitrary fact that has nothing to do with the context of how we define racism. Um, People arguing about what racism is or isn't as a definition is completely missing the point, particularly from a Christian perspective, of looking at the humanity of a person, right? The way that Jesus sees us. I've said this all the time. I don't put standards on the world. That doesn't really. The world's gonna be the world. They're going to hell. They're gonna go to hell. And I'm not saying that as somebody who is self righteous. I'm just saying that that's the truth. You can't put standards on the world. The scripture already tells us that we were once like the world, caught up in the sway of Satan. Ephesians 2, right? And you has he quickened or made alive who were dead in your trespasses and sins and follow the spirit of disobedience. So anyway, and we're by nature the children of wrath. But when you're having the conversation about race in America, context matters. And context matters, and this is why you need to know your history, because it informs it informs the conversation. Many people will fight you and they'll grab these other. Don't do that. Don't get, if you're one of those people trying to have that conversation. God bless you, but don't fight with people who don't want to hear the truth. That's a lot of people just don't want to hear. But when people say no, 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 do you want to listen? Like, do you want to understand? Because if people do want to understand, here's how you break it down to them. You break it down to them using the context. So you have the history of this country, right, which was built off of the labor of black people. So the wealth of this country was built off of the brutalization, of black people. That even when slaves, of course, we don't have to go through the whole slavery gamut because most of us can, we know some stuff about slavery. But people don't really understand the brutalization of lynching didn't really exist during slavery. That was a very rare occurrence, if at all. Why? Because that slave was labor. That was money. You're not going to throw away your labor. Slaves were very valuable. Right? So there was not a whole lot of lynching going on in slavery. The real lynching came after slavery. It came after Reconstruction. So you're looking at the dawn of the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, up to the 40s, 50s is when lynching started to slow down. And you can easily say that they just traded in the rope for a gun, right? And you got a whole nother conversation about the real lynching. I remember my granddad telling me about coming back from the war, and he fought in World War II. And I was sitting down talking with my granddad, and he was telling me he came back from the war. He was like, it was a different time back then. There wasn't no street lights. They were lynching folks out here. I was like, wait, what? What are you talking about? He was like, yeah, they lynch people all the time. You better not be out after dark. So there's a context that white people don't want to live in. A lot of white people, not all white people, but they don't want to deal with that. They want to brush past that because it won't allow them to construct their own narrative about race. It won't allow them to. They just don't want to hear it because it doesn't allow them the freedom to ignore the injustice and the sin that's really going on. So after slavery, you have a free people, quote unquote, right, who have been brutalized, and just murdered and treated horribly. Fun fact, even after slavery, even after the sale of slaves from the transatlantic slave trade was discontinued, meaning you could not go over to the West Africa and buy you some slaves. Even when that was discontinued, they created slave farms. You know how you have a farm for cattle, and you have a farm for pigs and a farm for chickens, right? And you produce. Well, they had farms for slaves because they could no longer produce them by just going over to Africa and buying them. So they created breeding grounds. This is where the term mother effort comes from. If you guys didn't know that, now you know. That term because sometimes they would force the slaves to have sex with their own mothers, and they would put a bag over the man's head and make him. I mean, that's sick. But we need to know the history. You need to know. So they created these breeding grounds for. I mean, this is the history, and there's a reason why we don't talk about it. There's a reason why this stuff isn't in the history, but it's so grotesque. It is so brutal. It is so inhumane. It makes you sick to your stomach. And you'll be a believer in capital punishment if you read some of the stories that are in the archives from slaves about what they went through. People, I mean, this isn't, people who were one generation removed from slavery. You can look in the archives now in Congress, and I don't think it's called, I forget what it's called, the National Archives though. But anyway, so you move forward to this period of racial violence that doesn't really stop, right? Because the whole point of the Great Migration was black people were trying to flee that violence. So you now have a free people, and the government has made a backdoor deal to allow for the racist KKKs to take back their 40 acres and a mule since Reconstruction, right? And so you have violence. You have years of racial violence from the end of Reconstruction era, so you're looking at late 1860s, 1870s, to the 1940s. During this time, you have robust economic suppression. Okay, you have economic suppression. You have what is known as redlining, which is banks refusing to own, refusing to lend money to black people to buy land, property, loans, whatever, what have you. It's hard enough to get along now. I can't even imagine what it was like, you know, in the 40s. My dad, um, he makes good money. He's a doctor. And he told me about how he got screwed. Um, and he had more money than half the people they're giving loans to. And he had to go around to multiple different places. And this in the 80s. This is in the 80s. I talked to my granddad. He was saying the same thing. He was like, yeah, he was like, I had to go to Macon. I think he lived in Warner Robins at the time. He was like, yeah, I had to go all the way to Macon to get a loan. You know, and here it is, 40 years later, right? My dad has the same issue, and he's a doctor. So you like, oh man, you done made it. Good credit, good money, good job, good income. Can't get that loan, doc. You, you know, so this is this is the history, right? Behind, so you have racial violence, you have economic suppression, you have, and all the while now, the wealthy class, which is primarily white people, have been profiting. Okay, they've been profiting off of this system. So the reality is that that system of the Constitution, when it was written, you know, there's no other people group that's been listed as not a person, but blacks have been. You know, blacks have been the ones that are in there as 3/5 of a human being. This, which lets us know that the rules of engagement that the Constitution, the ideals, that those who framed this Constitution did not have blackness in mind. When they thought about the greatness of this country and the goodness of, you know, seeking out God and inalienable rights, they didn't think about black people. And that can't be so that context is the context by which you need to understand race in this country, because that's how it was. That was how it was conceived in the mind of the founders of America. Right? Now, I'm not saying America isn't redeemable. I'm not saying that I'm not grateful to live here. Well, if you don't like it, just leave. Well, that's you creating your own narrative, right? You're just creating your own narrative. That's not actually allowing the true foundation and framework of what has actually happened in this country to be discussed. And there's a reason for that. And in short, the reason is because they don't want to deal with it. But you have to give the context. You have to know your history. You have to know your numbers. So people talk about, and I watched a great live by Preston Perry. He talked about this. People love to talk about black on black crime. Now, isn't it interesting that people want to talk about black on black crime, but don't want to talk about 60 years, 70 years, 80 years of lynching? Does that not strike y'all as odd? Y'all want to talk about black on black. Y'all killed more y'all than, you know, people want to talk about black on black crime. They don't want to talk about lynching. Lynching is way worse than what black people have experienced. Because the context of literally allowing people to live in insufferable conditions for decades, right? And then having huge policies. So you have a free people, because black people were free after slavery. So thank God, Civil War solved everything. Even though Civil War, let me go on and say this: people need to stop saying that the Civil War was about race. That is one of the most stupid. And I see people who are professors of whatever. That is one of the most stupid things that I've ever heard. You have the President Lincoln himself say, if there was a way that I could preserve the Union and keep slavery, I'm literally quoting him. He said, if I could preserve the Union, meaning keep the country from splitting up and let them have their slaves, I'd do it. The intention, there was no moral or righteous reason that Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, what y'all need to go study is the laws that he signed before he freed the slaves. That's another story for another day. Because all of us who think we came from Africa didn't come from Africa, because he signed away the last piece of the land. There's a reason why a lot of us got Indian in our family. And we don't know no African, but we all know Indian. They ain't gonna tell you about that. They ain't gonna tell you how they changed the name to Negro from a lot of the Indian names on the books in Virginia. You can check it out. They ain't gonna tell you about the census that don't exist in the 1860s. There's a this is history. They don't want us to know this. Anyway, I digress. So you got slaves, right? And you got the Civil War, and the Civil War was about uh, a power struggle between the agricultural North, agricultural South and industrial North. And the North obviously didn't want the South to have more power. And the South don't need the North because they got agriculture. They're like, man, we don't have to trade with y'all. We don't have to do this with y'all. North got industry. But the South, the South is like, nah, bro, we can do our own. We don't need y'all. We got our slaves. We got raw goods. We can do what we want to do. Right now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but when people try to present the Civil War as if it was this moral thing where the North people just woke up to righteousness, do y'all know one of the biggest mass graves is in New York City of slaves, and it's still there over there near Bull Street. I saw it. I went and saw it. I walked. I was there. Mass grave. What does that tell you about slavery? Why you don't ever hear about slavery in the North, but y'all got mass graves up there? I'm trying to give you the context, right? Because the context is, well, the North was righteous and the South, and these rebel flag wearing, rednecks, they were the ones who were racist, and the North wasn't racist. But y'all got mass graves. Where did mass grave come from? Since ain't no slavery. I'm just telling you the facts. Go look it up. Go. Why is there a mass? Why is one of the biggest mass graves ever found in New York City? Right across, I think it's on Bull Street. Somebody was doing something. It wasn't just down in Virginia and below. Right? So the context, and I'm learning a lot of this stuff. I'm giving y'all some sources. Dr. Joy DeGruy has some fantastic material that you have to read. Peer reviewed, checks all the boxes that people want to have checked to say, where are you getting your information from? Dr. Joy DeGruy has awesome stuff. You need to check her out. She's got a lot of stuff, free material online. It's great stuff. But anyway, my point is when you're talking about racism, you can't leave out the context of this country. So not only do you have slavery, not only do you have, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of lynching, depending on whether you want to start and stop when the history books start and stop, or when the testimonies of black people start and stop. And like I told you, if you follow the testimony of black people, they'll tell you they just dropped the rope and picked up a gun, picked up the law books and kept it going. If y'all have watched Just Mercy, I don't know if y'all have watched that, but that's a tough movie to watch. But when I watch stuff like that, I'm like, what the heck, man? Like, burn it all down. None of this has changed. Like I feel all of that. Because you're like, what? Like, this is still like going on? Yes, because it's a system. And just because you personally have not experienced it doesn't mean that it's not alive and well. That's what the context is for. Because the context shows you the system. It shows you, wow, okay, black people, they were free in slavery, but what's that freedom look like? Right? After slavery. Okay, wow, they were free to be lynched. They were free to have no say in their own economic prowess. There was a slight little golden age in I want to say it's 1860s, maybe first 2 years, 3 years of the 1870s, and that was it. And people love to highlight that as like that's just that's all, like all of black history and our greatness was in this 10-year window, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, you have to give people the context, and you got to learn this stuff. You got to go research and read this stuff, because the educational system, there's a reason why they don't want you to know this. So people want to tear down monuments. I'd rather you tear down these monuments in your mind that have you blocking what's like the way that race has really worked in this country. So when you follow that trend from that legacy of lynching, right, till you move forward and you realize, oh wow, not only do you not have the right to vote until almost the 70s, right? The economic disparities that exist there, and then you get into the policing, which started with sheriffs. And they weren't policing blacks because blacks weren't human during this time, right? Then all of a sudden became human. Then all of a sudden we had a right, and they were acting as slave catchers. That was one of the jobs of the sheriffs, So when people want to talk about policing, I'm like, let's talk about the origins of policing. People don't want to talk about that stuff because they know what it looks like. People don't want to talk about the 13th Amendment that says, oh, slavery is abolished except when you lock them up. Well, that's convenient, right? So you have these systems that exist that are wicked and evil, and the context behind them was the same context. Don't miss me now. Slavery was an economic wheel that used brutalization and terror and inhumane acts of violence as a way to produce capital. It was about the love of money. What's the Bible say about the love of money? It's the root of all evil. So it wasn't just like, oh yeah, like we got slaves. It was like, oh yeah, we got slaves to produce capital, to produce money, to enrich and enlarge ourselves, right? And so even though the quote unquote we have been progressing as a society from the violence of slavery to the violence of murder, to get land and property and resources and to stop anyone else from having a seat at the table, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Where they took a black city and burned it to the ground and bombed that city from the air. Yes, the U.S. government did this. Go look it up. Tulsa, Oklahoma. I want to say it's 1921, 23. Anyway, I don't remember the dates. There's so many others. I mean, we hadn't even talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. I mean, you have this is the context, right? So the reality is when you're having these conversations about race, you have to learn to wield this information, to know your history, and to get people to say, okay, we're not just starting where we are. I never owned a slave and you've never been a slave. That is an ignorant statement. That's but people are going to say that. Oh, they're going to quote that all the time. I've never owned a slave. You need to stop making me feel guilty for. Whoa, 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 whoa. My job is not to make you feel guilty. If you feel guilty, that's on you. That's not my burden. My burden is to give you the reality that we're living in. Right? It's the same way as like if you're trying to have a conversation about inflation, you can go, what was inflation back in the 70s? And what has changed? And what are the prices that have gone up today? Right? And you show them, oh, wow, look at all the wages, look at all the prices for gas that's gone up. Look at the price for, housing that's gone up. Look at the price for milk and eggs that's gone up. Now look at the wage and how the wage has adjusted. That's how I can tell whether I'm having a fair wage or not. Context helps, the context of history. So when you're talking about race, people don't want to talk about history, and there's a reason why. And it's a system, and that's why slavery is such a pain point when you're talking to white people about this stuff. Is because they want to go, oh, slavery, and they just want to end it because they have to start with slavery. That's how the country started, and so the problem is, when you start there, it's going to show you the context behind, okay, at what point were black people free? No. At what point? I'm not saying that people didn't make it through the cracks. I'm not saying that black resiliency isn't a beautiful thing about our culture. I'm just show me at what point did the United States government make proper restitution for the violence they enacted upon people that they once called animals and now call citizens? Simple question. I just want them to point it out. Show me. Because are they going to say 1964? Are they going to say when they integrated? Because they didn't integrate when the law passed. Nobody wants to talk about the federal government. Y'all don't remember that? Federal government having to come down and force white folks to get out the way and to protect black women getting integrated to schools. I remember my dad was telling me, my mom, if they're, if they're 60, 55, they old enough to remember this stuff happening real time. Real time. Born right in the 60s. So anyway, that's the context. That's a valid question if you want to help somebody understand. I don't understand what all this race stuff is about. So okay, did the United States government enslave black people for its own economic gain? Is that a reality? Yes. Did they do that to white people? No. They didn't. You get what I'm saying? You have to contextual. The context is everything. So, well, did they do that? So they did. Okay. So was there evil that the government did? Was there evil quelled and over with? Was there any restitution that needed to be made right after the Civil War? Was there anything that black people deserved for what they went through? I'm just talking in the past. I'm not talking about now. Okay, so did they make a fair and equitable society? No, we know that they didn't, right? Because everybody loves to talk about Martin Luther King, what he did. Okay, well, let's move that on up. Okay, so black people got the right to vote. Okay, did that make it a fair and equitable society from that point on? You have to force people to say, because people love to state that, you know, they love to state what they disagree with. They love to state how they don't agree with how black people are angry about race or whatnot. All right. I'm gonna back up and I'm gonna go in a different framework because we love to talk about how racism affects. And this is Dr. Joy DeGruy that I'm quoting. Okay, but black people love to talk about what this racial violence did to black people generationally. But what it did with white people is it ripped them of their humanity as well. It stripped black people of their dignity, but it stripped white people of their empathy. White people lost their ability to empathize because, culturally speaking, they saw black people as less than because they treated black people. Now, this isn't all white people. This is as a society as a whole, right? As a society as a whole, this is how black people were treated. They don't tell you that there used to be, barbecues and cookouts, and they would be like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna barbecue a nigga today." And I know I'm not making that up. Yes, there are pictures. Yes, this is a real thing. Go look up Dr. Joy DeGruy. She will lay it all out for you. She's got the books, the resources, all of that. I'm not gonna do your research for you, but this is a fact. And they would do it at the church service. They'd be like, yeah, like, we're going to go to church and then we're going to go hang a nigga. And then and then after they got done torching him, setting him on fire and hanging him, they would cut off pieces of his body, limb by limb, and auction it off. This is all true. They would make shoes out of black skin. This is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I'm not making this. This is your history. Are you telling me that person who is a great granddad teaches their grandfather, who teaches their father, who teaches the son? You telling me that there's no legacy of that passed on? How can you skin a human being alive? How can you? I mean, so this dehumanization is very real, and nobody wants to talk about this part. So a ordered society where blacks stay in their place and the whites get to live and flourish how they want. That is a very real. That is historical reality. People say never forget about 9/11, and rightly so. But what about Tulsa? Or we just go, like I mean, I didn't fly no plane into a building, so I don't see why I should have empathy for people who lost their loved ones and have to deal with the trauma of trying to move forward with their life after some great atrocity has happened. I mean that the lack of empathy is real. Because that is how our government has functioned. Our government has put black people in a status at best of lower class citizenship. And so when black people fight for anything more than that, they are getting, they're messing with the system. They're messing with the system. So from a biblical perspective and a Christian worldview, the Bible teaches us that we are supposed to love the just and the unjust, that we're supposed to love the sinner as much as the saint. We start within the house of God. We start within our own families and learn how to love each other there. And as we grow in our relationship and love for Christ, the love of the Holy Spirit, the Bible says the Holy Ghost has shed the love of God upon us in our hearts, Romans 5. We want to grow to the place where we can walk in the power of the love that Jesus had, so that while he was being crucified, he saw those railing against him and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they love that we desire to have as Christians. And so from a Christian perspective, you can't construct of the wickedness of the racial system that has been set up in America and not want to seek restitution for that. The reality is those who benefit the most from the system of racism in this country are most comfortable. Because that's just the truth. Those who get the privileges, they don't want to give that up. I'm not even tripping because in my flesh, I understand that. Like if somebody told me, you're 8 times less likely to get shot by the police just for being the way you look. I'm like, all right, cool. I ain't tripping. Like ain't nothing wrong with that. You're 5 times more likely to get approved for a loan. Really? Wow, that's pretty cool. And what's crazy is after people get, and let me tell you what's crazy about that. People literally get fuming mad about things like affirmative action while ignoring the whole history of our country. People literally get mad. It is not right that just because you're black, you get to get in a position in school. You get to have a scholarship, and that workplaces have to hire a certain amount of black people, and it shouldn't be about that. And I'd say you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be. But given our history, the history of this country has shown us fair well that those in power can't be trusted to wield it wisely. So when you can show me historically where you've done a good job in power with black folks, then I will say I'll trust you. But you ain't got no history to show that. Your history has shown quite the opposite. Your history has shown. So that's the reality that, when you literally have people that are mad, fuming mad because of affirmative action, and they're citing affirmative action and not even hearing the delusion that they're walking in. The delusion of like, I know y'all didn't have the right to vote for like a whole generation and a half, but now that you do, like, what's the big deal? I know that for 80, I'm being generous, 80 years, at least 80 years in this country, at least probably 2 generations of wealth, you guys didn't have an opportunity to build any for yourself. And whatever you got was by the grace of God and grit. But you didn't have that opportunity because there was a systematic system in place from the banks to refuse to lend you. And matter of fact, you need to go study about how redlining created the inner city, because the whites moved out to the suburbs, and the businesses, everything was in the city, and the whites moved out to the suburbs, and blacks could not move out because guess what? They were refused loans. They were refused credit. They were not allowed equal status under the law to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were not allowed these things. And the redlining still goes on. The gerrymandering still goes on. I was just, me and a coworker were we were laughing. But we were laughing to keep from crying, in the sense that we were just talking about the polling because, we had our primaries on Tuesday, and we were both talking about Atlanta and how the same thing that happened when Governor Kemp happened in Georgia again in Atlanta. How is it that the machines went down in Fulton County, but not in Gwinnett County for the same, where the black people primarily live? The voting machines were broken and messed up. I know whites and blacks who lived there who said it took them 2.5 hours. And one guy said he got there in the morning. He was like, I got there when they first opened. It took me 2.5 hours to vote, talking about the machines were down. Primarily where the white people live, no issues. This stuff, man, look, this is the system, right? My point is that if you want to have these conversations, you have to talk large. People love to use individuals like a Ben Carson. I'm not saying I'm a victim, but I'm telling you that the system victimizes people. That's the system. It's racist, it's evil, and that's what it does. And so when you want to talk about race, that's what you do. You talk about the systems. Because and if you're a Christian, here's what you do. If you're a Christian, let me help us. Here's what you do. You challenge people to do what Jesus did. You remember Zacchaeus, right? He was a tax collector. He was an evil man. He extorted the people. And when he made his repentance to God, right, he turned around and said, anybody that I did wrong, because his heart had changed, right? Because his heart had changed, he said, anybody that I took money from, I'm going to give y'all that back plus, I think he said at least 3 times as much. He said, I'm going to give it back plus interest. So the question that we should have as Christians, right, when you talk, people get mad about reparations. I don't really care so much about reparations for personal gain as much as I do for the system. For the system, right? Because people don't want to talk about that. So if you're talking to a Christian, you say, how bad, how unrighteous and evil was Christianity? I mean, yeah, I might as well say Christianity. I mean, it wasn't the biblical Christianity, right? But I'm not even, my mind is going so many different places. When you talk about slavery, slavery was perpetuated by people who claim to be Christians in America. This is 100% true. 100%. They twisted it. Same with Thomas Jefferson. They ripped certain books and pages out of the Bible, so they didn't want the blacks to read. They whipped and beat the blacks. These are, I'm quoting black people and their testimonies that are in the National Archives. So I'm not making this stuff. Y'all go do your own research. Okay? So black people got beat for actually reading the Bible and all this stuff, and they took pages out. They didn't want black people to know the truth. So these so-called Christian men were a huge part of the enterprise of slavery. The question should be, from as a Christian analyzing the government, how evil was that? I mean, how bad was that? A lot of white people, they struggle with empathy because they don't even feel it. You know, you kick a dog and they'll cry, but you show them a picture of a lynching and they'll be like, "What was back then?" You know what I mean? Like it's crazy how deep this stuff is. Literally, like I'm that type of person because I grew up, seeing a dog as a dog. I'm not saying that I don't care. I'm just saying it ain't no human, so you ain't gonna see me. Oh man, it's a dog. Y'all don't do that with homeless people, but you go do anyway. That's that. Let me get back to the point. The point that I'm trying to say is that when you challenge people, say, how evil was this? As a believer, how evil was slavery? What should be done? I know slavery was eradicated with, but what do we do as believers to make sure that something like that never happens again? What do we do as Christians? Shouldn't there be some kind of change? What should be offered? Okay, so you mean to tell me that, wait, so the system went from slavery to Jim Crow and lynchings and KKK? Okay, so that's even worse. So what should the government do to make this right before God? I mean, because we saw Zacchaeus. Jesus was willing to minister and have dinner with a wicked man who wanted to get right with Jesus, who wanted to see Jesus, climbed up that tree. Jesus said, I'm just go to your house. Jesus wasn't afraid to encounter him, but when he encountered Jesus, boy, did he want to do some things differently. So how does the U.S. government, how do they do something different other than what they did? Oh, not only did they lynch them, but they economically chokehold them. They literally put black people in economic chokehold. Couldn't lend, couldn't get wealth. Oh, and they wrote the 13th Amendment and then locked black people up like they were pigs. Wow. Oh, and Tuskegee experiment. Oh, and war on drugs. Oh, and gerrymandering in Poland. Oh, and I can keep going. That's the context of this country. So what should the U.S. government be looking to do? Oh my goodness. Now hear me. I believe that you're going to have pandering liberals. I'm not a fan of liberals because I'm not a fan of the policies of liberals. That's my personal opinion. Because I know the history. When you know history, it gives. I'm telling y'all, when y'all know history, when you know who's been the mayor for how long, when you know who's been in the Senate for how long, when you know who has voted for what policy and for why, that's going to change how you. That's going to change how you think. Right? I'm not blue is good, red is bad. That's not me. I'm not that guy. So I don't see politics as the answer. But when you talking to a Christian, right, I recognize that you're going to have people who are liberals who are going to see this and talk about reparations and all that stuff, and it's not. And then you're gonna have Republicans who just, people who get angry and upset about the idea, like, it's all about pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The reality is, it's somewhere in the middle, because that's where God is. God ain't on nobody's side, right? But it doesn't mean that both sides don't have an element of truth. I'm not telling you I got the solution for the way forward. What I am telling y'all is that when we have these conversations about race, we got to put context to them. And I believe this is a context that will help people. The reality is, the heart can talk with you and have a mind to listen. That's the part that God has to do. We can do the rest. We can do the rest. We can find the voices that help us to articulate and break it down, and we can do that stuff. The hard part is the heart part, and that's the part only the Lord can do. So that's why I deal with stuff from a Christian context, because I know Jesus is the one that makes a difference. So when people claim Jesus, I be like, no, I'm gonna hold you to that standard, because you said you follow Christ. All right, we go see. And I'm saying that for the black church and the black community as well. It's just that when in this context, when we talk about race, those who don't want to have the conversation, they don't want to have the conversation because if you put the historical context of what has happened to black people, they can't say that there has ever been a point in the history of this country where black people were given the opportunity by the government. Because let me tell you, the vote is a right. So the fact that black people were a citizen, quote unquote, right, in the 13th Amendment, and then you got to make a right for them to vote, tells you that they ain't really, that's second class citizenship. Stuff right. A lot of stuff right. He didn't get Jesus right, and I pray to God he did before he died. But he had a lot of stuff right, and that point is right. So I think that's a great way to challenge people. At what point in the history of our country did the government make proper restitution for the sins that it has committed as it relates to legislation concerning black people? Opportunity concerning black people. If you put your foot on a person's neck for 200 years, are you really upset that the neck hurts after all that time? These are just questions. I'm just saying, like, do you really think if you economically oppress a people for 50 years, that in 4 years they're supposed to have it figured out? I'm just asking. What opportunities have you given them to better themselves? Education. I just want to know. Education, job opportunities, economic. Does the government have a right to help the people it's oppressed? Do they have a responsibility? I personally don't think so, because I don't think that government is righteous. I think that it's amoral. I think it's the people that's in it. Which is why I challenge people with the gospel. And I challenge people who call themselves Christians to say, hey, you Christian? Okay, let's see. You may be Christian in your personal beliefs, but if they don't affect how you do policy, well, your Jesus ain't really Jesus of everything. Because my Jesus, he's Jesus of everything. He's over my lifestyle. He's over my policy. He's over my conversation. He's over everything. And I don't get it right all the time, but when I get it wrong, boy, don't he let me know. And boy, don't I got to get it right. So, anyway, I pray this helps y'all. I hope that, it helps you guys be able to verbalize and have those conversations. Because the truth is, for a lot of us, we preaching to the choir. We already know this stuff, right? It's having those conversations with other people. And for me, what I found is that when I put the right context in place, a lot of times that's why people won't talk. People know who they can argue with and who they can't. And there's a reason why. And I'm not the guy, let me tell you, I'm not the guy to get on Facebook and go back and forth. I used to be that guy. Ooh, and God has delivered me. Y'all didn't know me, but God has delivered me from that. I'm not that guy anymore. I'm like, hey, let's have a conversation. You want to talk? All right, hey, message me. Here's my number. Let's set up a time. Let's talk, because reason. And that's what I want. I'm interested in. I'm not interested in arguing. I'm interested in reasoning with you. Come, let us reason together. Let's get in this word. All right. That's what you believe. Okay, and 90% of the time, folks don't want to do that. The reason they don't want to do that is because they know they don't have a leg to stand on. If they talking with somebody who's smart, somebody who knows their history is dangerous. They're dangerous, and that's I encourage you guys, learn your history, know your history. Like I don't know everything there is to know, but I know enough, and I know enough of the peer reviewed people who will check those boxes so that I can say what I need to say. Absolutely, and it gives me power, it gives me a authority because I know what I'm talking about. Right? Read you some books, get you some some footnotes, study. Don't just trust YouTube and Google. It's not a real resource. Well, it is a resource, but it's not, it's not a, you can't cite it. You can't go, oh, Google told me, you can find one on there if you know what you're doing, but anyway. All right, that's all I wanted to share. So I hope that helped you guys, and I hope it encourages you to have those conversations with other people. Set the context for race, because you'll hear those trigger words. You'll hear people go, I don't see color. You'll hear people go, I was never a slave. You never, I never owned a slave. You never were a slave. You hear race is just a social construct. You'll hear those things. Take them back to history. Take them to the roots. Take them to the context. All right. So in this country, how are relations between black people and the government? Okay, and so when did they get rectified? You see what I'm saying? That's how you get people to think. No. Okay, so the context around how the beginning of this country was blacks and the government had it real bad, and I'm pretty okay. So it wasn't just they were second class citizens, right? You agree with that, right? It was that they were treated as lower than animals, right? And then you have the Bill O'Reillys, right? People were like, oh no, they had good quarters and stuff, but the Constitution said they were 3/5 of a person. So did they ever say that about any other people group? Okay. All right. So when did that get rectified? Do you feel like not being able to force somebody to have sex with their own mother and to rape them and pillage them and murder them at will and treat them as property, do you feel like that's rectifying? Is that what you think? That if the government says, hey, I no longer treat you like a pig, that is rectifying? Okay, so when did the government see blacks as equal in the eyes of the law? Okay, was it the war on drugs? Okay, no, I'm just trying to figure out. Okay, so during this time, how big of a wealth disparity do you think there was from 1865 to 1945? How big? Do you think that matters? Do you think it has an effect on an entire group of people when you do that to millions of people? Okay, well, what about when you criminalize a group of people and send them to prison for doing crack, which is a much lesser version of the drug cocaine that is actually in the affluent communities, white communities, which is brought over from Colombia in boats and planes, which black people did not own? Do you think that's okay? But you said the law was okay. At this point, they made up with black people, but they're criminalized. Okay, so what do you do with Nixon's, head policy advisor saying that we just did this to get black people, and he's quoted saying that? Okay, so I mean, okay, and what about the redlining? So you have economic disparity by the banks for groups of people for 60 years, right? Plus poll taxes, plus. And that's why if you're smart, people won't talk to you. I'm just being honest with you. There's a reason. They know it. There's a reason why they won't talk to you. I have had conversations with white pastors years ago that would not come. They called me brother and shook my hand. I sat down and ate ribs and steak and all of that and sang and lifted my hands in their churches. I'm not being a hypocrite. I'm telling you the God honest truth. Sat in their churches on their pew, been to their house, drove in their trucks, went to their worship service and said, let's talk about race. Whew. What? Nope. Not gonna do it. Not gonna do it. You want to know why? Because they know if they get in the ring with somebody who's smart and who knows the Bible and their history, they ain't got a leg to stand on, because the Bible tells us what we should do. And it's not pro-black, it's pro righteousness. Don't get it twisted. It's not about being black and right. It's about being righteous about what's been done to black people. They don't want to talk about that because they got to deal with their heart. Because other people that you can finagle. Sometimes you can. You can just kind of get around on other people. That's other people. But when you learn the tools to learn how to talk about race in the right context, the evil. For some people, that's exactly what it is. And let me tell you, the evil, don't get it twisted. The evil just ain't in the ones who want to shoot you. Because there are some who feel that way. As long as you're a good nigga, as long as you stay in your place, they don't mind it. Absolutely. And that's how we've been socialized. That's what I'm saying. That ain't nothing new. What? The same way my granddad was saying that there were jokers trying to lynch them. Guess what? That was somebody who went to go lynch somebody. And they went home and taught their children. And that stuff is, that's real. But don't get it twisted. The evil isn't just in that. The evil isn't just in those who write the laws. The evil is in those who don't speak out. The evil is in the apathy. He don't just work in the proactive. He works in that area too. He works in the ones who sit and say nothing. The ones who hear the racist conversation. I remember the Lord was working on me back when I was in college, and the Lord was working on me because I would laugh at jokes that were nasty jokes, and I never would say them, but I would laugh, and the Lord was like, "What you laughing for? That ain't funny." And at some point, the Holy Ghost I had to become pure enough, because blessed are the pure in heart, right? I had to grow in my walk with God till I got I just had the purity for that to actually not be funny. Because guess what? The truth was, it was funny to me. Which made me just as guilty as the one who said it, because I laughed and consented because it was funny to me. And I had to grow to the point where God helped me to be like you, where that is disgusting to me and not funny. And then help me grow to the point where that doesn't just stay a personal feeling that I feel, but something that is actually the way that you feel, so that that's not appropriate. I don't want you to think that you can talk that way around me and that I'm going to be okay with it, because I'm not. Right? So a lot of this stuff is just, if all the Christians who call themselves Christians in this country who were white spoke up and did justice the way the Bible says that they're supposed to, a lot of the structures surrounding these horrific racial policies that have existed for decades would be gone. But that's going to require sacrifice. That's going to require courage. And it's going to require a lot of these white folks to give up the very things they benefit from. Oh, because don't get it twisted. That bias exists. Oh, it's all good and well. I'm so glad you're doing well. But if you going to move next door to me? You go date my daughter? Who? You go worship in my church? Oh, just let any fundamentalist Baptist church have 40 people from the hood just decide to join their church and not assimilate and still be themselves. Man, what? It was just, anyway, so I'm not trying to get off the point. My point is just to state that a lot of this stuff is in people's hearts. And what happens is when you learn to articulate race in the right context, you'll be able to draw it out. Because that's the whole point, is to show people this is about the heart, man. This ain't about how you feel. I don't care how you feel. I care what the Word of God says. You're not standard. I can take the Word of God, put it on this historical lens of what's going on in this country, and say, whoa, talk about unrighteous. And pointing out one unrighteousness does not negate another. So pointing out what black people do or don't do because we're all sinners doesn't stop anything to do with the narrative that I just described of systematic racism and injustice against black people. Oh, well, like I told you, black on black crime. Well, one sin don't change the other. You just got two sins that need to be rectified. But the point is, it doesn't need to be rectified. Anyway, but like I said, that's, People have to face themselves and face the truth. So I hope that I've been able to share some tools, historically of how we combat and have these conversations, because the real goal is to be able to give an accurate defense and reasoning, and learn not to argue but to reason. Somebody really wants to have a conversation. A lot of times people just want to tell their side. What do you think? But they just want to counter. But say, no. You really, all right, let's set a time, let's set a date. Where we have an hour, right? Where we have some time to talk. No. We ain't gotta do it over Facebook, because that's not productive. I want a conversation. If you want a conversation, I'm open to that. If you want an argument, you can keep that, because that's unfruitful. I'm not gonna argue with you about what is righteous as far as how you should treat people. I'm not gonna do that. You keep that over there. So anyway, I just wanted to share that, and hope that helped you guys. All right, y'all have a good one.